I'm just going to have a little argument with PowerPoint. Bear with me a moment. Can you see it? Is there a useful screen in front of you?
Yes.
Wee. I do it's not tweet, I do Zoom with my kids that I work with. So hello, I flew across Salisbury Plain at the speed limit, no less, very much less than the speed limit. I was stuck behind slow-mos all the way home from work, so I was like, need the loo. I hope you're all well. It's been fascinating and it's really interesting. Some of the things that, like, hearing you talk, what was really interesting, like the idea that kids don't study something from their home school, home country, that's heartbreaking. I can't speak to whether it's the same in England, but I wouldn't be surprised if not worse, because, you know, fun with English nationalism at the moment. And the question, like, surely that somebody will do a PhD on that. It's brilliant. And it's just, I've been working in Wales. I'm on a project with some people based in Swansea, and this cross-curricular, like, thematic based rather than discrete subjects is really strong in Wales, and they've looked at the Scottish thing, and it's kind of, maybe England will catch up at some point, who knows, don't know. So I suppose really it'd be useful to give you a little potted history of me. I've been teaching, I trained in 2007 and I trained in foreign languages, so I trained to do secondary French, Spanish and German, basically because I like talking and I'm nosy. But I taught in Barnsley, which is where all the kind of pit villages were, so it was a bit of a tricky area to be a teacher, and actually I ended up kind of focusing more on literacy, special needs and stuff. My current setting is literally by Stonehenge, so I sat in a traffic jam there today looking at the stones. It's a middle of the road school. We've got a lot of forces children. That's the thing that really strikes you about my school. We've got loads of kids from everywhere, so there are a lot of kids who are EAL, and it's really interesting, and sometimes it can be quite tricky. I'm kind of drawing on my private practice and also my research, because I teach 2 days a week, and then I do research sort of based in Bourdieu and the whole, like, idea of power, agency, identity, which was really interesting to pick up from you, Inga. That culture, language, they're so connected that you can't split them, and you shouldn't split them. You really shouldn't. So that's me. I suppose really what I found very challenging, I ended up kind of winging it a bit with teaching migration, because I'm not a history teacher, I'm not a humanities teacher, I don't have GCSE history or geography, it wasn't my bag. I did physics A level and engineering as a first degree. I found it really hard to find a place to teach it. You get a little bit of it in GCSE citizenship. There's a small unit around teaching migration to and from. There's some in geography with, like, population movement and a bit of population density, but that's kind of quite a clinical look at it, just about resources and all that geography stuff. I don't know much about it. I'm sort of reading specs. And again, in history, it's getting quite clinical. It doesn't make it relevant, present, now. How does this matter to me? And I found that really troubling, because I speak, you know, a few different languages, and I realise I'm quite an oddball for an English person that actually speaks different languages and expects to speak a language when I go somewhere else. So I actually found space for it in an English lesson, in English as a subject. The setting around that was kind of, we were working on non-fiction text, and there was an exemplar, here's what your final product from this half-term's work could be. And it was a letter to an MP about migration and what should we do about it and why and things like that. So I wrote a scheme of work. I did my long-term planning, did my short-term chunking and all the rest of it. And my output was this: I want my kids to write a letter, formal letter. They need to know the practicality of what have I got to get the kids to do. But actually, it's about more than just knowing how to stick the address on the right and this on the left. And it's about actually engaging with something. And so with my year 9 class, we started out looking at their own understandings and what their relationship with kind of those other migrant folk people. Interestingly, in that class, there were 3 kids who were from a migrant background. So it was, and the other kids hadn't quite done that maths in their head somehow. They were such a nice class, but they just not made the connection. So, where are we? Yeah, first lesson, and this, the orange bit, I've left it orange deliberately. It clashes hideously with pink, but we were looking at different types of migrant in the first lesson. So the kind of economic migrant, the notion of refugees, legal, illegal, because it was at a time when there was, like, I taught it 2.5 years ago. It was a really charged time kind of around Brexit, and there was a lot of horrible discourse in the media. And then lesson 2 was a hard question. Should migrants and refugees be allowed into the country? I think it was the second or third slide of the programme of study. I asked them those questions, and I can't see if it's got numbers on it or not. I can't remember. But we had a really frank discussion as a class, and I think it's really important to consider kind of laying your groundwork. We lay groundwork very, very carefully, that you can say, if you disagree with it, say, but you've got to be respectful in your language. And the kids were brilliant. Some of them didn't know, and actually when you're 13, 14, last thing Thursday afternoon, you're not necessarily going to know. But they were really gracious, and I think giving them a space to talk about it was really good. And it was really important for them to be able to have that discussion. So I kind of, to do the teaching, we did case studies. So we looked at kind of, once we'd understood that there are different sort of flavours of refugee, migrant, people that move, and that actually some people choose to and some people don't. And we looked at kind of different scenarios. So the kids were aware of Syria. A lot of the kids' dads had been fighting in Syria, because Salisbury Plain, Wiltshire, it's a very military county. I'm from Warwickshire, so near Birmingham, and there's not the same culture there. So it's quite alien to me. I learned a lot through the kids' journeys, but we looked at kind of how somebody might, like the route they would take from Syria to get to the UK, and then we stopped in Calais and had a look at kind of I can't remember the place where people stop in Calais. I can't remember the name, it's left my mind. And then we looked at kind of then where people would choose to migrate, and sort of examining the notion of like an expat versus a migrant, because there's such a snobbery, such a language, and it was just so Bourdieusian with my kind of research ahead on. And once we explored these different options, we looked at the practicalities of writing a letter, and the kids did a really, really good job. But I think for me, it was a real eye-opener, because it was a class I taught and I got on really well with it. Cracking kids, I love them to bits. It meant we had a really good relationship, and they, you know, I was pregnant at the time, so they nurtured me through my pregnancy, bless them. But it meant we built a relationship before tackling this. They knew that they could say something that might be contentious or tricky, and they weren't going to get hammered for it. They weren't going to get told off. They might get told, do you think that's a good idea? Think about it. And sometimes the other kids would question. We were very lucky, but I would say it's always worth making that safe space first. So do something relatively straightforward before you tackle a task like an emotive task. So like I used a lot of Stacey Dooley documentaries. We watched the one where she did about in Greece, and a gentleman, there was some quite traumatic scenes in that. And subsequently, following kind of a lot of decolonising the curriculum on Twitter and learning more myself, it's very easy to do the kind of harder, not through choice, kind of migration journeys with the kind of white saviour complex. And that's, I need to think about that, because I hadn't even considered it. Now I've considered it. Now I need to work out how I would do it differently. And with my private practice kids, we look at some very different experiences of teaching migration and working through it. And it's also, what do you want to gain from it? What we wanted from a curricular perspective to be able to write a formal letter. It's more than that, isn't it? We all know that it's more than that. We want the kids to be able to talk about it in a kind of constructive manner, not be detrimental, not make other kids feel bad. Yes, ask questions, but do it to understand, not to belittle. And I think my kind of concluding thoughts, I think it needs to be formally engaged with earlier, you know, not in secondary in year 9, because your teacher happens to think it's an important topic, because GCSE, they all, you know, sort of 14 to 16 years old, they don't all do it. The first 3 years of secondary school are where it's that the broader education that needs to be done there. But primary school, I've worked in a school in the Dizzy Heights of Trowbridge. The Polish community in my little town in Wiltshire is huge. Why aren't we talking to them? It's so important. They're amazing. They come to another country. and they do their life. That's to be respected. And the stories need to be personal. I think with anything, it's great learning about William the Conqueror. That was 1,000 years ago. Life happens, we've moved on. And it's the focus on the language. Language is so powerful. You can build people up, you can destroy them. So when the children are talking, talk about how you should talk about it. And it shouldn't be left to an individual teacher. And it's kind of the whole Bourdieusian thing. I think in some ways, I wonder if immigration is left to the sidelines on the English camp slightly deliberately, because if you engage with it, if you empower your young people, if you give them a language to talk about something tricky, it's going to disturb the status quo, and the powers that be, adults, though, you know, those that are higher up the hegemonic kind of dominating structures, are going to have to wriggle, and they don't want to do that. And I think that's partly why it's not taught a lot in an English context. But it was so worth doing, and I would absolutely do it again. Kind of had a child in the middle of it, so it messed it up, but with my next lot of year 9s. That's me done. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen.